In 1919, a conference opened near Paris to draw up a treaty that would bring an end to the First World War. United States President Woodrow Wilson had drawn up his principles for peace in a 14-point plan presented to Congress in January 1918. When the Germans surrendered, they accepted Wilson's 14 points as the basis for peace. But many of Wilson's principles were ignored or rejected by the delegates to the Paris Peace Conference. The resulting treaty caused much resentment among the defeated Germans. It caused much bitterness and disappointment among the victorious Allied countries as well. The Treaty of Versailles was a turning point in history. The terms of the treaty changed the map of Europe and created conditions that ultimately resulted in another global conflict, the Second World War. The world's First World War was sparked in 1914. The Central Powers of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy were pitted against the Allied powers of Great Britain, France, Russia, the United States, and Japan. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14-point plan for peace was accepted by the Germans when they surrendered in November 1918. Among Wilson's principles for peace were open treaties of peace openly arrived at to supplant secret treaties, intrigues, and alliances. Freedom of navigation of the seas. Removal of trade barriers among nations so far as possible. And the creation of an association of nations to guarantee peace for all nations, large and small. The peace talks, which opened near Paris in early 1919, were dominated by Italian Premier Vittorio Orlando, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. The Russians were not invited to attend. A revolution in Russia in November 1917 had resulted in a new communist government that took Russia out of the war. The defeated Germans, who had organized a democratic republic, had hoped to attend, but they were forced to wait until after the peace terms had been settled in secret conferences. President Wilson went to Paris determined to fight for the principles contained in his 14-point plan. But it was an almost impossible situation. Wilson's first point, open covenants of peace openly arrived at, was ignored. Secret agreements had been formed by Britain, France, Russia, and Italy for dividing up the enemy's territory after the war had ended. President Wilson refused to accept any conquered territory for the United States. But Britain and France acquired Germany's African colonies and much of the former Turkish Empire. Japan was allowed to take over German territory in China, as well as the German Pacific Islands north of the equator. Several of the other points contained in Wilson's plan were also ignored or rejected. Freedom of the seas was dropped. Nothing effective was done to remove trade barriers. There was no real attempt to reduce arms, and there was no impartial adjustment of colonial claims. However, points 7 through 13 received more favorable attention because they would weaken the defeated Central Powers. Belgium was restored. France regained Alsace and Lorraine, which the Germans had conquered in 1871. Italy received some former Austrian territory at the head of the Adriatic Sea. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was divided up. Part of it went to the newly created countries of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Part of it went to Romania, and part of it went to recreate Poland. Germany and Russia were also forced to give up territory to Poland. The French gained Syria and Lebanon. The British gained Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. The map of Europe was greatly refashioned by the Treaty of Versailles. It was a turning point in history, and the difficulties involved in adjusting to the changes created conditions that culminated in a Second World War some 20 years later. By the terms of the treaty, Germany lost 1/10 of its territory and population. All of Germany's overseas colonies were claimed by the victorious Allies without compensation, and Germany's army and navy were greatly restricted. In addition, the treaty made Germany and her allies responsible for causing all the loss and damage of the war as a consequence of the war imposed by the aggression of Germany and her allies. The treaty made Germany liable for payment of war damages or reparations. The German representatives were shocked by the severity of the terms of the treaty. They protested that the conditions by which they had surrendered had been violated. However, the Germans were faced with the threat that a war blockade would continue until the treaty was concluded. Thus, the German government accepted the dictated terms. On June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors in the Chateau of Versailles, the treaty with Germany was signed. Treaties were later completed with the other defeated Central Powers. The delegates left the Paris Peace Conference disappointed and bitter. The French, who had suffered 2 German invasions in less than half a century, had wanted all German territory west of the Rhine River established as an independent republic or buffer state. When this idea was rejected, French Premier Georges Clemenceau insisted that Allied forces occupy the Rhineland for a period of time. The Italians felt that they had been denied their rightful share of territorial claims. They resented the refusal of the British and the French to allot German African territories to Italy. The Italians seized the port of Fiume on the Adriatic Sea, which the peace delegates had refused to grant to them. Meanwhile, in defeated Germany, there were large demonstrations against the terms of the treaty. U.S. President Wilson believed the treaty had many faults, but he also believed that the treaty's injustices could be corrected by a League of Nations, an association of nations created by the treaty to guarantee world peace. Wilson returned to the United States, prepared to fight for the Treaty of Versailles and the creation of a League of Nations. But the U.S. Senate had to approve the treaty and the League, and there were many senators who did not want the United States to become involved in the affairs of European nations. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee advised approval of the treaty, subject to 14 reservations. But President Wilson, tired of compromise, refused to agree to any changes. Wilson took his fight for the treaty and the League of Nations to the American people. But he fell ill while on a cross-country tour of the nation, and he was forced to return to Washington, where he spent many long months recuperating. His campaign for the League of Nations had ended. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. Separate treaties with Germany, Austria, and Hungary were completed in 1921. Now that the First World War had ended, the world's leaders sought ways to prevent future conflicts. President Wilson had warned, "Arrangements of the present peace cannot stand a generation unless they are guaranteed by the united forces of a civilized world. I can predict with absolute certainty that within another generation there will be another world war. What the Germans used in the war were toys compared with what would be used in the next war." The League of Nations was established in 1920. It included a council dominated by Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. Germany was admitted in 1926. Russia became a member in 1934. The United States never joined. All members of the League promised to submit their quarrels to arbitration, but the League had no armies or navies to fight aggression. In 1921, U.S. President Warren Harding called a disarmament conference in Washington, D.C. At the opening session of the conference, U.S. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes amazed the world by declaring that the only way to disarm was to disarm. The result of the conference was a treaty that limited the size of the navies of the United States, Britain, Japan, Italy, and Germany. And a nine-power treaty was signed that affirmed the independence and the territorial integrity of China. However, the nine-power treaty did not end the smoldering conflicts between Japan and the other great powers of the East. In 1928, more than 60 nations, including the United States, signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which renounced war as an instrument of national policy. However, the pact provided no means for enforcement, and the nations did not reduce their armaments. In September 1931, a bridge on the South Manchurian Railway in China exploded. The bridge and the railway were owned by Japan and guarded by the Japanese army. The Japanese used the explosion as the reason for starting their conquest of Manchuria. Meanwhile, in Italy, a new and aggressive party, the Fascists, had come into power, and the party's leader, Benito Mussolini, insisted that Italy must be strong. In 1935, Italy attacked Ethiopia. The Italian forces quickly overran the country, forcing Emperor Haile Selassie into exile and incorporating Ethiopia into the Italian Empire. In 1936, a revolt of the Spanish army against the Republican government of Spain settled into a 32-month civil war. General Francisco Franco crushed loyalist resistance and emerged as the dictator of Spain. This caused American Ambassador Claude Bowers to warn, "With every surrender, beginning with China, followed by Ethiopia, and now Spain, the prospects of war grow darker." In Germany, anger and resentment over the Treaty of Versailles was exploited by Nazi leader Adolf Hitler and was a factor in his rise to power. In 1936, Hitler, who had been secretly rearming Germany, sent his forces into the Rhineland, which had been evacuated by the Allies but was still, under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, demilitarized. In March 1938, Hitler announced that Austria had become a province of the German Reich. Then, Czechoslovakia fell under German control. But when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Britain and France decided to honor their pledges to the Polish nation. On September 3rd, 1939, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. Despite the Treaty of Versailles, or perhaps because of it, the world was propelled into another global conflict, the Second World War.